Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Ask the Author session on the new Streets That Fit report from the International Transit Forum. It's great to have you all here. Welcome to the Ask the Author session on this is not what I want to. Streets that. It's very good to have you here. The people that are with me are Philippe Crist, who's the lead author, Luis Martinez, and John Pritchard, who were involved in this report, part of the modeling. We'll have 30 minutes. We'll have a 10-minute presentation by Philippe on the findings of this report. And then you have 20 minutes to ask questions. The idea of this format is really to keep it short and sweet, to give you the opportunity to get a taste of the work that we've done, and then maybe to either read the report if you haven't done so already, or to get in touch with us and start a discussion on these very important issues. So this issue of urban space really came to the fore during the pandemic, when many cities around the world created pop-up lanes for bicycles and cordoned off streets to make them accessible for pedestrians. But it's really not that new of an issue. In fact, it started maybe in the 70s, early 80s with bus lanes. And the question is, who should use the space? The modes that transport relatively few people but needing a lot of space, or maybe other modes that are more efficient and give more opportunity to other people. So this is a question that Philippe and his team looked at in detail, simulating what redistribution of space would do in a mid-sized cities. And there's some very interesting findings that I think are applicable pretty much around the world. We'll hear more about that. And that start from the premise that space should serve people and not things. And what would that mean for urban space? I'll leave it at that. I'll hand over to Philippe for his presentation. We'll try to stay within the 10 minutes to give you the gist of the report. And then it's to you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom, because that's where you can type in your question. Start doing that right now if you want. I'll pick them up and we'll discuss them right after the presentation. Philippe, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks on behalf of both Luis and John, my co-authors on this report that was produced in the context of the Corporate Partnership Board of the ITF. Now, I think one of the things we can agree on is that the allocation of urban space is fraught with tension. Space-related decisions have largely been based on improving the speed of vehicles and thus the travel time of their occupants to enable them to maximize what's scarce to them, namely time. But for communities, the impact of speed are less clear-cut. It contributes to improving access for those who are traveling fast, but at the same time, it consumes a disproportionate amount of space.
Turn off the sound in the background.
I believe that someone else has their speaker on. I only have one speaker on here. So all of you in the room, if you can turn off your speakers, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I think you need to turn off the speaker of the.
Oh. I seem to, I only have the one speaker on here.
You need to turn that speaker off, Philippe. Otherwise you get hit. And can all panelists mute themselves, please?
All right, now how is that? This tension, not the tension we're having right now, but this tension of space allocation in cities is exacerbated by the fact that space allocation revolves around the question of how vehicles use that space and not on how well it serves people, despite the many potential and desired uses for that space. Now, such an approach favors car users and occupants over those who would travel by other means or who would use that space for other purposes.
Philippe, hang on a second. Hang on a second. Hang on a second. We have a technical issue here. Sorry for interrupting. Philippe. Philippe, sorry.
Yep. Just chilling out here.
we need to fix this very quickly, otherwise it won't get us anywhere. Philippe, I think you have either YouTube or LinkedIn running in the background with the stream. You need to close that down. We need to fix this very quickly, otherwise it won't get us anywhere. Philippe, I think you have either YouTube or LinkedIn running in the background with the stream. You need to close that down. We need to fix this very quickly, otherwise it won't get us anywhere.
I don't. All right. How is that now? I think you are correct. There must have been an open window in LinkedIn. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. Please excuse me. All right, now can you see my screen?
Yes.
So I was saying that the tension is exacerbated by the fact that space allocation revolves around the question of how vehicles use that space and not on how well that space is serving people, despite the many potential and desired uses for that space. Now, such an approach favors car users over those who would travel by other means or who would use that space for other purposes. One of the things that we know is that that pressure to use that space differently and more efficiently or more equitably have grown, as Michael has said, and accelerated during the COVID pandemic. And if there's one thing that we've learned over the past 2 years, it's that the rapid and sometimes significant reallocation of space is both possible and desirable. Now, there's an important distinction to be made between the use of street space versus the allocation of street space. The use of space relates to how much physical space people and vehicles actually consume as they move. It varies by transport mode, by time of day, and by urban zone. On the other hand, the allocation of street space represents the supply of space made available for vehicles to operate, park, or otherwise idle. Now, currently, space allocation is largely static over the course of the day. Such rigidity leads to street configurations that typically reflect the needs of the most space-consuming modes and uses. It invariably results in inefficient use of that space. So with all that said, and with all the technical difficulties we've had, here are our 5 recommendations. The first is that we need to adopt meaningful indicators for how street space is used. Today, there is no straightforward and comprehensive space consumption indicator that is in widespread use. Our report describes an indicator that fills this gap, and not a new one. It's been around since the 1970s, but one that hasn't been very well used outside of France where it was developed, the square meter hour indicator. This indicator has 3 components. The first one is the space exclusively occupied by a vehicle as it moves. That's the dynamic space consumption component. The second component is the amount of space used as the vehicle is idle, stopped, or parked. This is the static space component. And finally, there is the time duration component, how long this occupation of space takes place, both in movement and when the vehicle is stopped. So a second recommendation is to reallocate street space use to account for different users and different uses. Prevailing road classifications are largely designed to manage the use of road space by cars, vans, trucks, and buses. Opening that space to other vehicles, users, and uses, even non-transport uses, may bring benefits in many contexts. But more diversity and flexibility in street space allocation requires a shift in the practice of allocating space. and it must account for a wider set of vehicles and uses. In this study, we've looked at a much broader range of vehicles and classes of vehicles and modes that were traditionally assessed, and broken these down into 6 families based on size, weight, and typical operating speeds. And in particular, we look at emerging types of vehicles and use cases, especially in terms of rideables and shared use vehicles. Building on the work of the Good Street project in the Netherlands, we have designated a series of indicative urban traffic environments, which include a nominal speed and vehicle mix to which the environment is designed. In this framework, vehicular access is granted only on those parts of the network whose design is adapted to a vehicle's mass and dimensions. Now, such an approach would enable a broader range of safe uses of mobility space and help support a wider variety of street uses. This taxonomy also helps determine where shared use of space or dynamic reallocation of space may safely occur. Our third recommendation is that street space allocation should put people first. It must focus on how that space serves the population and not only on how vehicles occupy that space. Decisions about street space allocation should therefore always take as their starting point the space required per person, not only per vehicle. And when we look at this using the square meter hour indicator, we can see that, for example, a 10-kilometer round trip, 8 hours parking, a typical commute trip, the order of magnitude between a public transport trip and a car trip is 100 times. 7 times, 6.5 times more for a car versus a bicycle. And this gives us an indication of which are the most space efficient modes and which are those that are the least efficient. And this is helpful in policy context. Our fourth recommendation is that moving from rigid to demand responsive street space allocation can bring benefits, as here in Lyon with this testing of an intermittent bus lane. These benefits accrue from a more space-efficient use of streets and the ability for people to travel safely with a wider range of vehicles and modes. Now, limited and dynamic reallocation of street space also serves to improve the resilience of urban transport systems through the ability to flexibly meet changing demand. In our modeling, we tested and combined 2 main strategies. On the one hand, the limited and dynamic reallocation of space, and on the other hand, the introduction of a greater number of travel modes whose characteristics and use of space were accounted for in the modeling of overall system performance. And this is what we found. We found that a composite indicator looking at transport network performance that includes mobility outcomes, accessibility outcomes, environmental outcomes, space use, and safety saw a 12% increase in performance with these 2 measures, but mainly coming from the limited and dynamic reallocation of street space. Overall, over a 24-hour period, this set of combined scenario in which these 2 measures were implemented saw almost a 20% reduction in the amount of space used during the course of the day. CO2 emissions reduced by 5%, particulate emissions by 4%, and when we modeled the full electrification of the fleet, we saw that that reduction could go up to minus 23%. And finally, our last recommendation is that the reallocation of urban street space must be carefully designed and implemented to avoid negative safety outcomes. Street space reallocation should incorporate the principle of the safe system, that humans will make mistakes and that the traffic system actors share responsibility for the safety of all, not only the safety of motor vehicle occupants. Speed management and traffic separation, where necessary, are 2 pillars of the safe system. But integrating safe system thinking should guide all street space reallocation, both when it is integrated into dynamic and time variable street space allocation and static and permanent street space allocation. But we have to understand that when it is integrated into dynamic and time variable street space allocation, this will limit the range of achievable reconfigurations, and that makes sense because street spaces should more or less resemble themselves as they go through the course of the day, serving different uses. So those were our 5 recommendations. Now, if there's one thing you should take away from this report, and what we've seen in the last 2 years, is that streets are not set in stone. They have and always will continue to evolve. This report sets out some ways in which to measure, to encourage, and to accompany the reallocation of street space to help create better cities. Why? Well, to make streets that fit us, all of us better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Philippe, and my sincere apologies for this this technical hitch at the beginning. That wasn't very good. As I said, we're doing this for the first time to live stream it on YouTube and LinkedIn. The test ran well. This didn't go so well. My apologies. I hope you still took away interesting things from Philippe's presentation. And I always love watching them because he has the best pictures. And I actually love this picture that we put on the cover of the report because you know, it tells us something. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A, that little two bubble icon at the bottom of your screen. I'll pick them up and we'll start the discussion. We've lost a little bit of time, but maybe we added 5 minutes depending on how many questions you have. I mean, that's for sure. So let me put the first question to our trio of authors, which is from Christian Ilmish, and he asks, are authorities in urban areas obliged to make road space available to privileged parking of private vehicles, often at no cost, backed by legislation? Can streets be rebuilt without space for long-term parking? So the legal question, I guess that's different from country to country. Is there an obligation? How did we get there?
I can take this. I'm going to try to see if I can turn my camera back on. I think that it depends on which regime you are. In some countries, there is a legal obligation to provide equal mobility options for people. And in that case, that would include also prevailing ways in which that mobility is delivered. So it depends on the country and the region that you're in. But I think from a principles point of view, if you are providing space in cities for both movement and storage of vehicles, then at least that should be managed in a way that doesn't exclude other desired uses and other, in many cases, less well-off users. And so one of the things that we tried to do in this report was to provide both a metric for measuring how space is used per traveler, which is not something that is often incorporated into policies, and then use that as a basis for making some of these decisions. How much does our allocation of space use all the population in the city, including those that are least favored? How well does it only improve options for those that can afford or have access to a vehicle or a car? And so I think these are some fundamental questions that, of course, have to be dealt with in the legal realm. But what this report wanted to do as one of its aspects was just to provide the metric with which to inform that discussion.
Nathaniel Tan has a follow-up question, which asks about EV parking. Is that being part of the static dynamic parking times model that you used, electric vehicles?
I'll say that it includes all vehicles, and it's not. It has no. The amount of space used by a vehicle is the amount of space used by the vehicle, and so that's linked to speed and its size. The charging is, of course, static use of space. And I know, Luis, we were working on some of the modeling of EVs in that. And so there's some additional insights on that as well that are interesting. Luis?
Yes, mainly you answered it. The only thing is we'll have a much more detailed analysis of this reality of the electric charging in a future follow-up report that we are starting preparing also this year. That will see much more detailed analysis of what would be a new reality on a city where the presence of electric mobility would take much larger share.
And just to add on that, what we're doing in this new report is looking at the amount of time those vehicles are idle as they're recharging, and that is part of the space consumption metric indicator or set of KPIs that we produce in that report.
Yeah, and just one last thing to this to follow up is that in our findings, what we found is when we consider all these different modes, actually the requirements of how much parking is needed in the city, in our modeled city, went down by almost 10%. So just by reallocating the space and having all these other options, we do decrease the amount of space that is needed. But an electric vehicle won't solve the issue of the fact that for motor vehicles, about 80% of their space is a static space usage, which accounts to while they're parking. And electrifying the fleet will not solve this issue.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. More questions are coming in. Some of them are quite long and some of them are more statements. I can read those out, but when you have a question, try and make it short and pithy so I can relay it more easily and don't have to read out long paragraphs. But here's one question from, or two questions from Lorna Stevenson, who asks, you spoke about dynamic reallocation of road space, but how do we do that while ensuring safety, particularly for vulnerable road users? For example, how do you build a safe cycle lane that can also disappear if needed? First question. And second question, how do you balance dynamism and simplicity? In the UK, we have some drivers arguing for time-limited traffic restrictions and others arguing against overly complicated rules. So one question about safety and the other one about keeping it simple and still usable.
Luis?
Okay. Thank you for the question, Lorna. The first thing, as Philippe showed, there are already some examples in the literature and the application and case studies on dynamic usage of space. One thing is that a bus lane that can be converted into a normal lane, but can be also a bike lane that can be converted. And one thing that can be used is the street to have lighting, dynamic lighting that would sign what is the mode that is attributed to that space dynamically over the day. We also tested if these logistical elements of change would make sense to do it every moment or every 30 minutes or just few times throughout the day. And we see that these intervals, it's mainly with the big variations of demand, which like when you go out from peak period, when you return to lunch, it's like when you have big variations of behavior that happen on the type of trips that go on in the city. It's where you may need to some reallocation, also to make easier flows after to exit the city, because it depends also in the location in the city, to go out, for example, for commuting trips or in a residential area to reserve also spaces for the requirements of pedestrians when they are arriving home. And this is one thing. The other thing that you are asking, sorry, the other question was?
This was about simplicity and how we, some rules like dynamic parking restrictions and so on, is that overcomplicating things and kind of
the thing is,
acceptance?
yes, the reality is not simple, and especially when we are increasing the complexity of the number of vehicles that we have. The thing is that we see that the savings that we may have either in safety or either in efficiency and either improvement of the quality of accessibility that you are able to provide to users, it requires us thinking a little bit beyond, and we have the technology to do so. Then I think the simplicity goes with the requirements that we have also attached to it. Then I think that the current reality requires a much more dynamic management and more smart management of the space, which is quite scarce.
One thing I'd like to add specifically to the point of safety, because it is an expectancy, really. It's a really key point. That's the reason that we looked at different traffic environments. And when we said limited dynamic reallocation of space, what we mean by that is that not any space could become any other space. You can't go from a motorway, of course, to a pedestrian thoroughfare. That's the edge case. But even within street networks or street environments that are similar to each other, we impose constraints that would otherwise have allowed unsafe outcomes to emerge. So limits in the speed differential between vehicles and different uses, limits in the speed or in the mass of vehicles between different uses. And so we really did constrain the analysis only to those cases where by reallocating the space to another type of use or users would not lead to an unsafe outcome. Again, our starting point was the safe system approach, that we had to create a system that by design would increase safety in the use of the common space.
Thanks. We have a critical comment from an anonymous user that I want to share with you, and this leads to maybe a question about deliveries. He or she says, the recommendations are fine, but they ignore the range of regulations and controls that exist in human behavior. Creating livable communities requires deliveries, but controls on delivery time stop deliveries occurring out of hours. And this leads to false solutions, such as cargo bikes during the day rather than electric AGV overnight and collection points and locker banks. Secondly, the behavior of people in business is to be lazy. This is demonstrated by instant delivery, which many may be promised in 15 minutes, but is creating an economic divide between consumers who can't afford it and those who can. Did you have a look at goods delivery and goods transport in cities in this context and the space that it uses?
We're glad you asked that. These projects run 1 year, and they're a way of really getting some ideas out there. And so in this first year, we looked specifically at how passenger and personal mobility could be, how different schemes for reallocating space would impact passenger and personal mobility. We know, of course, that freight and urban logistics are an extremely important aspect of that. And that is why, Luis, maybe you want to describe some of the work we're doing now to address that.
Yes, we are finalizing also a report where what we do is simulate in the same city the presence of freight at the same time with the different 10 commodity classes that they need to, and we test different measures also at the same time to optimize the use of space, but also mitigate the carbon footprint of all mobility in the city, to be from passenger side, but also from freight. And we have dynamic use of space also on the parking locations that can be reserved dynamically for freight, because this is one element that is very important, maybe because when you have like a freight parking space that you need to have like a reserved spot that a person will come, and that would allow also to reduce very significantly in that report. We'll see the reduction on second lane or double parking. It happens very frequently nowadays, especially with parcel delivery, but also other types of deliveries in cities. And this, if better dynamically manage the street space, encompassing also the freight part, would allow us to reduce this burden, either for safety, but also for the fluidity of the cities. And I will hope that will be soon out also.
A further thread that is running through the questions I'm seeing here that keep coming in, which is why we'd add a few minutes. We're at almost 30 minutes, but we lost a bit of time at the beginning, is sort of implementation. And Pasquale Cancellara asks, what should we do? What should those cities do first that are heavily car-centered, where the modal split is completely in favor of the car and the majority of people would be against reallocation of space?
Ciao Pasquale, tutto bene? I think the first thing is one of the first things we did in this report, which is to say, let's measure the allocation of that space with meaningful indicators, because you can't really have a discussion about how the space is allocated if you don't have a grasp of how it's being allocated. And for this reason, one of the core contributions of this report is to try to get a indicator out there that can help authorities actually get a grasp over the efficiency of use of space in their cities. And then once you have that, then you can target, well, where are those areas where with small changes, you can increase the equity and the efficiency of the use of that allocation of space with some targeted interventions. Luis, you also have some ideas on what are the first steps. In fact, you come from a region where some cities have reallocated space for a long time.
Yes, and it hasn't been yes. The cover picture that we have on the report is from a city that in the 2000 converted all the city to remove all cars in, and you have just access to the outskirts of the city, and it's all non-motorized, just public transport and public vehicles that can circulate within. And the mayor has won 2 elections after. Then it's like people are afraid of this change, but after experience it, their life also has changed very drastically on the quality of life they can enjoy also in the streets. And this is a city, of course, it's with around 100,000 inhabitants, which then is not, but I think it's an example that we shouldn't take for granted, that people will not be happy with the solution that we'll get out of it. The thing is, people are always afraid of change. Of course, they will resist in the beginning. And of course, this is a challenge for political decision. And mainly, then the smart thing is to do it in the beginning of your or your period as a mayor. Otherwise, if you are in the end, maybe in the first year, people are still adapting and will be unhappy. But yes, and
if I can add one thing, it's that throughout the work that we did, and we did modeling in a very diverse urban region with rural areas, suburban areas, and an urban core. And throughout the work that we did, we saw that the greatest benefits from the reallocation, both permanent or temporary or dynamic, of street space was where space is scarcest, and that's in the urban core. So clearly, the kind of reallocation benefits that we can hope to derive are going to be in those areas where space is most contested. And what Luis is saying is right. Many times those who benefit from the current allocation of space will contest that, and those who would benefit afterwards maybe will not express themselves before because they haven't experienced that yet. And so in that respect, experimenting with the reallocation of space, like what we've seen during COVID, is quite important to give an opportunity for people in these areas where space is under tension to experience its use differently is important in trying to create both a constituency for that and a trajectory towards change. And what we've seen throughout cities that have done this is that many of those experimentations were then converted into more permanent reallocations of space.
And just one last point on that as well, from a more practical perspective, something as easy as reducing the speed limits in our cities already means to use less space for the lanes because they don't have to be as wide. And it also means that you can share space with other modes in a much more safe way. So something like that is already, I think, a clear first step. You reduce your speeds in your cities to 30 kilometers an hour, and all of a sudden the speed differential between a bicycle and a car is much less and it's much safer, and already you start to shift things. So, I mean, this is an easy first step that I think can be implemented in many cities.
Yes, but it has just one cost, which is, I think it's important. I think Philippe framed it a little bit in the presentation. It's when we have much more, it's like the cities were designed for just 2 or 3 modes or 3 vehicles that were there. And it was mainly walking and cars, and then with public transport among the cars. And when we start having a greater diversity of vehicles that we have a very wide range of speeds that are linked with, then there is, for the same access, the requirement by default of a number of wider space for dynamic use. And if we don't take it from the static use that we have currently for cars, it will be really, really from a safety, quality of life perspective. Then the cities, if they want to embrace also new ways of mobility, which is free floating, which would allow users to rely less on cars, they really need to rethink the space management, because otherwise it will be really a clash or a congestion of that space that is already designed and static to favor the major vehicle that was before, that was the car. And if you don't do this rebalance, as the space consumption of these modes that are slower on the dynamic component is higher, then you may have some very severe problems on safety, but also in life quality.
Thank you. I put a link into the chat of a project that I think is absolutely relevant for this, which is in Stockholm. It's called the 1 Minute City. And basically, it's they're creating modules like Lego pieces of how space could be used, like bicycle parking or park bench or trees or playground, and they're the size of a parking space. And they get the citizens in that street or that part of the street together and have them move around these things. So they actually physically see how the street space would change with different uses. I think that's a fascinating idea, and it involves citizens. It lets them create their space. It's highly visual. It's communicative, and it's something that I find absolutely fascinating. And I'm looking forward to hearing how that actually works out in practice. Let's take a couple of more questions, then I think we'll have to come to an end. There's one from Alan Wong, who asks about the metric that you've been using, the square meters per hour, and why is that a better measure than just the number of people in a given space? And that's maybe linked, and it's not really linked, but I'll link them anyway. The question, which is from, let me see, it's up here from Jayan Sangwan, who asks, is there a way to also harmonize these design elements, these design ideas in different cities, so to have an international or national standard, so that it's easier for drivers to adapt and not get confused when they move from one city to another? So we don't have a patchwork, and in every city you have to adapt to something that's different. Is there a case for standardization, or does that maybe make it difficult to implement some of these things?
On the metric, what I'll say is that the square meter hour metric is a metric that is more adapted to understanding the consumption of space as it is being consumed by people as they move around. And why is that? Because it takes into account the amount of space a vehicle requires in its movement, and that space is conditioned to two things. It's conditioned to the size of the vehicle, and it's conditioned to its speed. It's also slightly conditioned to the amount of lateral displacement the typical vehicle has. But all that's entering into, I mean, I presented the three components. There are formulas in the report that allow you to understand how to actually break that down. All that is included in the dynamic aspect. And then, of course, a vehicle, when it's stopped, takes up space. And it takes up space for as long as it's stopped. So those are the two other components, the static component and the amount of time it's being held there. The reason that the square meter hour indicator is interesting because it allows you to apply that indicator to actual trips, the distance and the amount of time those trips took. And so with the modeling that we did, it allowed us to get an aggregate number of square kilometers consumed during the day as vehicles undertook all the trips they did, which is something that a number of people per square meter, number of people per square kilometer would not communicate. And finally, it takes into account the load factors of the vehicle. So if you saw that the bus was the most space efficient using this square meter hour indicator, it's because we had a load factor that was, I think, around 50%. So 50% of the bus is full. Of course, if there was only one person in that bus, the bus is a large vehicle, the amount of space consumed by that one person would be rather large. And so, you know, this allows us to understand a number of different aspects, how space is consumed by different vehicles at different speeds, at different load factors for real trips in a city that is space constrained.
And what about the standardization question? Does someone want to pick that up?
Well, standardization on, so there's a number of ways to cut that, but there are, of course, in Europe, urban vehicle access regimes that are in access management systems that are put into place. There is movement underfoot to try to address the differences in those, both within the Commission and also within organizations that work in this space, Polis being one that's looked at how to think more holistically around UVARs, urban vehicle access restrictions.
Okay, thank you very much to our three panelists and experts. Thank you to you all for joining us. It's great. We haven't got through all the questions, but as I said, our ambition with this is to provide a window on some work that we do, but we invite everyone to just contact us with your questions or ideas, suggestions, to really start a conversation. That's the idea of this. So if you weren't satisfied with what you heard here, get in touch, send us an email, give us a call. You know, we'll be very happy to follow up. We'll be sending you an email with a link to the video. I hope we can clean up the video with a little snafu at the beginning. Let's see if that's feasible. Normally we do that, and we also send it to the people who registered but couldn't attend for one reason or the other, so that this gets disseminated. It's great you've been here. You've been a great audience. We hope to see you again. And actually, before we leave, where is this? Yeah, I will send you a little poll question, which will pop up on your window. This is just for us to do a little bit of a control exercise, whether what we do is actually useful for you or not. This is not about this specific, whether Philippe gave you the right question or not, but just generally, if you like this format and you think we should continue with it. So with that, again, thanks very much to Philippe, to John, to Luis, and we hope to see you all again. Be in touch, and we're looking forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Hay que abrir, si no, ya está en panel otro.